right? And so that can be very painful. So people have chest pains for this. It's generally not down the arm like you get when you have a heart attack, but it tends to be up in the shoulder region, kind of near the sternum clavicle region. And so it can be very painful. Every time the heart beats, it rubs against the pericardium. You can also have too much fluid. And this is not necessarily painful, but it actually puts pressure on the heart. So it makes it so the heart has to contract more forcefully to keep up with the needs of the body. So this is called cardiac tamponade. Cardiac tamponade.
So with the friction, do people still think they're having a heart attack?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So people are, so they think,
okay.
so they get confused by it, right? But it's something that you would need to you would want to go to the hospital for anyway, just because left unchecked, it could actually lead to some infection of the heart muscle itself. Okay, so that's cardiac tamponade, and that puts pressure on the heart. So they can actually drain some of that fluid out. I don't know how they treat that one, if they just give them antibiotics, fluids. I don't know if they put fluid into that space. That's a good question. Okay, so that is it for the heart. So we are actually going to be moving on to blood vessels. So one of the things that's important to remember about blood vessels is that they are actually organs. And why do you think they're considered to be organs? What's the definition of an organ? Different kinds of tissues, right? So it's not just one type of tissue, it's different types of tissues. So the blood vessels have smooth muscle, but they also have blood vessels that serve the blood vessel. They also have nerves that innervate the blood vessel, and they actually also have lymphatic vessels that innervate the blood vessels themselves. And so this is a definition of an organ, is it's more than one type of tissue. Okay. So we can define blood vessels as being arteries. And arteries, by definition, always carry blood away from the heart. Okay. In the one that we talked about that was an exception was the pulmonary artery, which actually it's still carrying blood from the heart, but it's not oxygenated. So most are oxygenated. So most carry O2-rich blood under high pressure. So one of the things about the arteries is that they have a thicker layer of smooth muscle than veins. And they also have elastin. So they have elastic tissue. And so what this does is that specifically, there's lots of elastic tissue in like the aorta, the blood vessels that carry the blood as it is being pumped out of the heart. And the reason for this is that we need the blood vessels to be expandable, but we also want them to contract, right? So that it expands and then the elastic tissue bounces back and it causes a contraction. So it actually keeps the blood moving, having the elastic tissue. Okay. I'll talk more about the elastic arteries in a minute. And the veins, on the other hand, carry blood back to the heart. They have not as much smooth muscle. They lack elastin, so they lack elastic tissue, oh, that's funny, elastic tissue. But they do have something that arteries do not have, and so they have valves. And what these valves do in the veins is that they help to prevent backflow of blood. So this prevents backflow of blood. Veins are also oftentimes associated with skeletal muscle. And the contraction of that skeletal muscle actually helps to move the blood back towards the heart. So if I walk around, right, the contraction of my muscles while I'm walking around is actually going to help pump the blood back to my heart. Okay? If I stand in one place for too long, then my blood will start to pool in my extremities. And I might also get varicose veins, where the veins start to bulge because the valves become damaged and the veins will start to bulge out. And that could also lead to the stagnation of blood, could also lead to blood clots forming, and we talked about that a little bit. So you could get blood clots forming in the legs, and so we use compression stockings to in people that need an extra support for their legs in order to keep the blood flowing back to the heart.
What about when people work out and their veins start popping out? What does that mean?
They work out and their veins start popping out. This had flashed on those legs of the Tour de France bicyclists. Have you seen those? That is just crazy. I'm wondering if it was because they're working out, they have extra blood, because in order to keep up with their exercise, they actually produce more blood, and so there's more blood in their body, and that's why their veins pop out. Veins are more superficial than arteries, right? Maybe that's why. Okay. So we can also talk about the layers of a blood vessel wall. So the innermost layer is a tunic. It's called the tunica intima. So the inside of a blood vessel has a space, and that space is called the lumen. So this is the tissue that is closest to the lumen of the blood vessel. So that's I-N-T-I-M-A. So this is the layer that is closest to the lumen of the blood vessel. So the lumen is just the space where the blood flows. Okay. So this is epithelial tissue. And it needs to be smooth. Right? So we need to keep the lining of our vessels smooth. If you get an infection in the blood vessels, that can cause them to roughen. And that infection could also lead to blood clotting, which could lead to a rupture of the blood vessel. So it needs to be smooth. Then we have the middle layer, which is the tunica media. This is my middle layer. And it has the smooth muscle and the elastic tissue. And then we have the tunica externa. So this is connective tissue with collagen fibers. So it tends to be white in the pictures of it because of the collagen fibers. And this actually contains all different types of structures, including blood vessels. So you're like, this is a blood vessel. How can there be a blood vessel within a blood vessel? But this is the blood vessels that serve a blood vessel. And they have a name. They're called the did I write it down? Vasorum. Let me look at my next page. Exactly. It's on and on. This is the vasa vasorum. Vasa, vas, or they also have nerves. The nerves that innervate the blood vessels are all sympathetic. So this is sympathetic only. So this is the same division of the nervous system that causes the heart rate to increase. But the nerves actually allow the blood vessel to contract or to relax. So it can constrict blood flow or it can relax and allow more blood flow to come in. So we'll talk more about that in a second. Okay. So if we look at these blood vessels, okay, we have large arteries carrying blood out of the heart. And then notice how they branch into smaller vessels. And then they go out and into small vessels called capillaries. And then the veins have the opposite thing. So they start out small and then they meet up like rivers, right? So they tributaries of the rivers until they meet up into bigger, they connect into the big veins that then carry the blood back to the heart. And we'll talk about what this lymphatic system is doing here in a minute. So this is the diagram that you need to know. So in lecture or in lab last week, we looked at this image. So the difference between the artery and the veins. So notice that the artery has a thicker layer of smooth muscle, and it also has this yellow stuff. And the yellow stuff is the elastic tissue, and it looks like Swiss cheese because it has holes in it. The tunica intima is the epithelial tissue that lines the inside. And then the tunica externa, notice it has blood vessels and yellow structures here. And the yellow structures are the nerves. The nervous system is usually drawn in yellow. Now, the veins also have valves, so they show it here. So as the blood comes up, if it's going to flow back, right, it's going to get caught in that valve, and so it's going to prevent the backflow of blood. So blood kind of gets pushed up, it comes back. It gets pushed up, it comes back. It gets pushed up, and that could be due to like walking, for example.
Now, why don't you have one for an artery? Is it because there's
a valve?
Yeah. Is it because
there's so much pressure that it would never have backflow. So the pressure differences in veins, the pressure is much lower than in arteries. I'm just going to skip over this because I screwed up my, okay. So I just wanted to mention that there are different types of arteries. The ones that are leaving the heart first are called elastic or conducting arteries. So one would be elastic or conducting arteries. So these are the big arteries leaving the heart. And we're going to look at these, like the brachiocephalic trunk or the carotid artery or the subclavial artery, right? So they are elastic. So they have lots of elastic tissue so that they expand and then contract against the pressure. and they keep the pressure high. And they even out blood flow. Right, so their contraction actually helps to keep the blood flow even through the body. And then the second type of arteries are called the muscular or distributing arteries. So these are the arteries that distribute blood to different organs, to like the skin or to the muscles. And they are very muscular because they are capable of vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So vaso means blood vessels, like vascular. Constriction means that we are going to decrease the diameter of the blood vessel. Okay. What this decrease in the diameter of the blood vessel is going to do is that this is going to increase the pressure, and so it will decrease blood flow. So blood is going to travel in the path of least resistance. So if there's like an open blood vessel and a constricted blood vessel, blood will flow to the open one. It will not force itself into the constricted blood vessel. So you can constrict your blood vessels to shunt blood away from organs. So we'll say that this shunts blood away from organs. Then we can talk about vasodilation. And what this does is this increases the diameter. It decreases pressure when it opens up. And so there would be an increase of blood flow. So this would shunt blood towards the organ. So like when you're hot and exercising, the blood vessels that carry blood to the surface of your skin would dilate, and blood would flow to the surface of your skin. You would turn red, you would start to sweat, right? And you would eliminate heat via evaporative cooling by sweating and having the water evaporate off the surface of the skin.
So then what's a good example of vasoconstriction?
So when you're sympathetic, your fight or flight response happens, blood gets shunted away from your stomach and your digestive organs, and it goes right to your muscles. Yep. So you can constrict that. Also, when you're cold, you turn pale, right? And blood gets constricted away. Maybe that's why when you have a fever, you also look pale, is that blood is not going to the skin because it's trying to heat you up rather than going to the skin. Okay. So then we have very small arteries, which are called arterioles. And these are very small vessels that lead into capillaries. Now, the arterioles also have something interesting associated with them. They have what are called pre-capillary sphincters. So what the sphincter is going to do is it's going to close off the capillary bed and shunt blood away from the capillary bed or directly through the capillary bed. So a pre-capillary sphincter prevents blood from going into a capillary bed. So if we go back and we look at our arteries, so the big ones are elastic. Then we have the distributing ones, the muscular. And then notice how we get to the arterioles, and these structures right here are the pre-capillary sphincter. So if this is shut down, then the blood gets shunted through, but it doesn't go into the capillary bed. And so that would prevent oxygen and carbon dioxide and nutrients from being exchanged. Now notice how then it is picked up by a small vein called a venule, and then it goes into bigger and bigger vessels and back to the heart. So that can, that's the continuation of the vessels. Okay, so let's talk about capillaries. So capillaries are where gas, nutrients, and waste products. So by gas, I'm talking about oxygen, CO2, so oxygen and carbon dioxide. Nutrients would be like glucose and amino acids. I'll just write glucose there. And the waste product would be like urea. This are exchanged between the blood and what is called the interstitial fluid. So the interstitial, that just means between the cells, inside the tissue. So it's inside, stitial is kind of tissue, means tissue. So it's all the fluid that's just inside the tissue, but is not in a cell. And each cell is bathed in interstitial fluid. So in order for gas to move, it has to be dissolved in water. In order for glucose and urea to diffuse, it has to be in solution. And so that's why all of our cells have to be bathed in water in order to have exchange between the blood and the tissues. So this means that they are thin-walled. They lack muscles. So they lack muscle tissue, right, and connective tissue. So they're essentially just the tunica intima. So I'll put just the first layer, tunica intima. And they are leaky. So red blood cells generally do not leave the capillaries unless there's been damage to the capillaries. But white blood cells can actually squeeze out if necessary in order to get out into the tissues and fight infection. So we have different types of capillaries. So the first type is called a continuous capillary. So types of capillaries. The first one is the continuous. And this is actually the least leaky. But it is the most common type of capillary we have in the body. So this is the type of capillaries that are in your skin, in your muscles, in your, going out to the fat. This would be the type. And it's continuous because it tends to have a continuous layer of cells, right? And notice how small they are, that only a single red blood cell can squeeze through. Okay, so they're very, very tiny. The second type is called the fenestrated. And when you talk about fenestrations, this means that there are little slits, little holes in it. So these tend to be more leaky. And these are found in the kidney, which filters the blood, and also in the small intestine, which absorbs nutrients. So if we look at what the fenestrated capillaries look like, they have slits, okay? So notice that even in the cells, there's holes, right? And so fluid can move out. So fluid tends to move out more thoroughly in the fenestrated. Then we have the last one, which is number 3, which would be the sinusoidal capillaries. So these are very leaky. They're the most permeable. So what happens here is that a lot of stuff can leave, maybe even red blood cells. So this would be like in the spleen. Remember, the spleen is the site of old red blood cells go there in order to die, right? And to be broken down and redone. And then we also have the bone marrow. And remember that red blood cells and white blood cells are derived from stem cells in the bone marrow. And so those cells have to get into the circulation in some way. And so they can get in via these fenestrated capillaries. And then also in the liver. So the liver stores a lot of stuff. Stores glucose as glycogen, it stores amino acids, it produces blood clotting proteins that have to be put back in, right? And so it needs to have a permeable interchange with the circulatory system. So those are the different types of capillaries. Let's skip over that. Okay. So the last thing we'll talk about today is what is called the physiology of circulation. And so this is where we talk about blood flow. So why does blood flow? And people who are physicists can even study the flow of fluids through pipes, right? And a lot of what they come up with in a non-living system is directly applicable to what we now know of going on in the body. So this is kind of a physics, right? Physics, which is the study of fluid movement through pipes, for example. Okay. So we have an equation. And so we can say that the flow of blood, which is milliliters per minute, is equal to what we call delta P, which I'll talk about what delta means and what P means in a minute, divided by R. So if I look at these variables, delta P is the difference in pressure. So that delta always means the difference in pressure from one area to the next. So delta P is going to be higher in arteries than it is going to be in veins. And so blood is going to flow more freely in an artery, more rapidly in an artery than it is in a vein, right? And then R is what we call resistance to flow. So this is our resistance to flow. And so one thing that affects the resistance to flow is the movement of the fluid against the wall of the vessel. So we have friction occurs where the blood moves against the wall of the vessel. So what happens then is that resistance is greater when the diameter is smaller. Because if the diameter is smaller, then the blood is going to have to move, more blood is going to move against the wall than if the diameter is larger. So if we decrease the diameter of a blood vessel, we increase its resistance to flow. Okay, so that's one thing that affects resistance. So I'm going to put that's my number one, friction. So that has to do with the diameter of the blood vessels. So you're going to, if you make your blood vessel expand and dilate, then you're going to decrease resistance and more blood is going to flow in that direction. Okay. So the second thing that affects it is the viscosity of the blood. What is viscosity? Thickness. That's it. Let me spell it right. What affects the viscosity of the blood? Amount of red blood cells, right? So polycythemia, right, where you have too many red blood cells, is going to increase the viscosity, and so it's going to increase resistance, so it would decrease flow. Generally, that's not a problem, but unless you're taking synthetic EPO for kidney disease or if you're an athlete. The third thing that affects it is blood vessel length. So this one's a little bit harder to understand, but the longer the blood vessel, the more resistance you have. So if you have a short little blood vessel that's going right to the organ and right to the capillary bed, there's going to be less resistance than if this blood vessel is very long, right? So the longer the blood vessel, the more resistance. And this becomes a problem if people become very large. Obesity actually affects the resistance, because if you get really big, then your blood vessels have to be longer. You're going to have more resistance, and so your heart is going to have to pump harder to get the blood to move out into the vessels. And so that's one of the reasons why being overweight can put extra problems on the heart and can actually lead to congestive heart failure. So being overweight stresses the heart because of all the resistance that it has to press against. Okay. So those are the factors that influence blood flow. So that's all I want to say. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there for today. And then we'll talk about some other mechanisms for how we regulate blood pressure. We'll talk about blood pressure and its regulation next week. This week, we are going to be doing the dissection of the heart in lab.